Hello. I just finished I almost said Enderall. That's a completely different thing. I almost just finished Elantris. And I have thoughts. So, disclaimer before I get into this. First, there's spoilers for the entire book in this. Be warned. And second, I'm going to be fairly critical of this section of the book. I did not like this final act of the book as much as I liked the first two. That doesn't mean I didn't like the book overall. I still think the book was actually very good, and I enjoyed it, and I'm glad I read it. And I'm looking forward to the next one, which is Mistborn. Um, More on that at the end of the video. But there are some things, a lot of things in this final section that annoyed me and that I didn't like. And thankfully, I'm not the sort of person who is going to let a bad ending, or, well, not even a bad ending, a mediocre ending, ruin an otherwise good story for him. Um, so, let's start with the good thing, which is that this whole climax, these last like 15 to 20% of the book, it's paced like the climax of a Wheel of Time book, which is the highest praise I can give for the climax of a book. It is dynamic, it is exciting, it is it is a breakneck pace, it does not stop. I read this whole section of the book in one sitting. I wasn't planning to. I was planning to read for like 20 minutes, and then I started reading and I couldn't stop because it kept pulling me. Even when things happened that I didn't like, that I was like, ooh, that's a really bad choice, Brandon. The way it was written, even if what was being written was something I didn't like, the way it was written was so compelling. So, in terms of pure technical skill, enormous credit to Sanderson for the entire book, but especially for this section. Okay, now on to the issues. So I have several issues. Let's start with the one that's maybe the most minor, but also kind of frustrating, which is that at the end, there's just a restoration of the old status quo. By which I mean the status quo from before the Shield, not the status quo from the start of the book. It's a complete change of the status quo from the start of the book, but it's a restoration of the old Elantrian order, and I hate that. Um, I don't blame Sanderson individually for it because I think it's just sort of an unquestioned trope within the genre. Fantasy just likes to do that. You know, the return of the king, as it were. And I'm disappointed by that because I felt like this book might have been going in a more interesting direction. I felt like there might be some real change rather than saying, oh no, the old system was actually great. The old order was good, actually. We just need to find a way to return to it. Woo! So I didn't like that. I also didn't like that apparently the peasants didn't want the nobility to be abolished. Huh? What? That's. I don't think it's unrealistic. Like, I can see that happening in real life, but I don't like that it's the choice that Brandon made. So so those are the like the very end parts that I didn't like, but those are just like the epilogue basically. The bigger issue I had came earlier on. Two big issues really with this climax. The first one is that Serene kind of loses all agency and doesn't get much to do in the ending. She's just kind of around while Hrathen and Raoden do all the cool stuff, which I didn't like. I feel like there was a disservice done to her as one of the main characters that at first when I read it, my sort of gut instinct was to, like, think that it might be like a sexist thing, which it still very well might be. Like, even well-meaning people have sort of like ingrained societal biases around stuff like this. But I don't actually think so. I think it's more the fact that Serene as a character, like her whole arc, just wasn't building up to some sort of epic conclusion. Like, I tried to think of a way to end Serene's story that might have been more impressive. Couldn't really think of one, which doesn't mean that I'm excusing the fact that Brandon didn't. If you can't think of a way to end your character's story arc, maybe you need to tweak that story arc a bit to make it to make it more amenable to an actual satisfying conclusion. So that's one issue I have, and the other really, really big issue I have is Hrathen realizing he's in love with Serene. I hate that. I got so mad when that happened. And I am choosing to believe it didn't happen. I am choosing to retcon it out of my personal memory of this book, because it completely ruins the point of Hrathen's character. Hrathen isn't a villain who redeems himself through the love of a good woman. That's such a boring, shitty cliche. Hrathen is a person with deeply held beliefs which are mutually contradictory. And he spends the entire book working through that. He spends the book tackling this contradiction. And his big heroic moment isn't that he chooses to save the girl he likes. It's that he chooses to follow that contradiction in his own beliefs through to its only logical conclusion, instead of trying to bury it and keep going the way things are. That takes an enormous amount of courage, and I think it's really impressive. And it's cheapened by the implication that he only ended up doing it because he had a crush. So I don't like that. I don't approve of it. Bad. Bad, Brandon. Bad. Put it back. Don't know what I'm doing. I do also have one less book ruining, I guess. None of this is book ruining. I'm being hyperbolic. Like I said, I still like the book. But one thing that doesn't really negatively impact the rest of the book as much as these two things do, and that is Adian. Was that his name? Keen's autistic son? So Sanderson makes the decision to have Adian's autism cured when he becomes a full-fledged Elantrian. Now there's two ways to interpret this. The first is a very uncharitable reading, which was my first reading, which is that being an Elantrian cures everything that's wrong with you, and autism was something that was wrong with Adian. This is a deeply unfortunate implication. No autistic person is going to love that particular version of the story. The other reading is less problematic, but still fairly problematic, and that's the implied reading, I guess, that Alien is still autistic because his numbers thing is actually his sort of naturally occurring autism symptom. He still is autistic, but the non-verbal elements of his autism, the part where he didn't really say anything or interact with anyone other than through counting, that might not have been a part of his autism. That might instead have actually been him being Hoed. Because the Hoed do sort of like they do retain parts of their personality, and the random mutterings that they do, they are the mutterings of the mutterings do have something to do with their actual personality and the sorts of things they would have thought about and talked about in real life. And so him being an autistic child with an obsession with numbers, when he became Hoed, numbers were what his mind latched onto. Like I said, this is a possible reading. I don't know what the intended reading was. Even this reading isn't great because it kind of implies the whole like high functioning versus low functioning divide that's also bullshit. But yeah, I've already talked in the first video. I don't think Sanderson handled neurodivergence well in this book, and I think he's aware of that. I think I read somewhere that he is aware of that and purposefully tried to change that in future books. So I'm not going to harp on about that any longer. Speaking of neurodivergence, however, there was an interesting section in my edition of the book. This is the 10th anniversary edition. And it has an extra sort of appendix at the end by Sanderson where he talks about a whole plot line that was cut from this book about Raoden's mad brother, the Mad Prince, as he's called. And he writes, and we even get a few excerpts from the original draft of the book. And ultimately that ended up being cut. I think that was a mistake. I think that the Mad Prince would have made a more interesting and compelling Act 2 villain for this book than Duke Tellery. If I were Sanderson, I would have cut Tellery and kept the Prince, because I don't think Tellery adds anything or is much of an interesting character. But whatever. That's just a minor thought I had. Anyway, those are my positives and negatives. There is one major element that I haven't discussed yet, and that is the sudden and explosive introduction of Cosmere elements at the end, or at least what I assume are Cosmere elements, because again, this is my first Cosmere book, but I'm assuming that the final epilogue with Hoid, which is annoyingly similar to Hoed, which even the book jokes about at one point. I'm assuming that the final epilogue with Hoid is a Cosmere thing, and that really intrigued me. It really got me excited to get further into the series, meta series, whatever. He talks about, what was the word? Let me check my notes. He mentions Investiture. He basically, which sounds like Investiture is basically the Cosmere, or at least Hoid's term for a magic system, because he talks about how this planet, which he at this point identifies as Cell, which I don't think was a name we had previously. I'm not sure if the actual people of the planet called the planet that, because Hoid is clearly from somewhere else. So he talks about how Aeon Door is one form of investiture, and implies that there are other forms of investiture on Cell, which we saw with with Shuden and with the monks, Diloth and company. I think that's interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing how that particular element unfolds in future books. But I don't really have much to say about it now, because that's all we've got so far. And the other real interesting thing about this book to me is it really doesn't feel like it's supposed to be a standalone. It's so clearly setting up a sequel. And it's weird to me that a sequel never happened, because surely Sanderson could just write a sequel now. Like, I feel like he's got enough clout at this point that he can get anything he wants published, probably. I could be wrong, but it feels like this book is aching for a sequel that would expand upon the other forms of investiture for a start on Cell, and that would deal with Fjorden and Wern. And obviously this book technically has a sequel in the form of the novella Emperor's Soul, which I will get to eventually when I get to it in release order, probably. But that's a novella, so I doubt it adequately wraps everything up. I could be wrong, maybe it does. But if it doesn't, then I'm definitely interested in a sequel to this. I would definitely read a sequel, especially one written by Brandon Sanderson now, when he's a more advanced writer, and presumably knows what he's doing better. What else? There was one other thing I wanted to talk about. Oh, right, yes. So, yeah, those are my thoughts about Elantris. I liked it overall, didn't love the ending, hated the Hrathen reveal about him being in love with Serene, but what are you gonna do? Next up, I'm reading Mistborn. And Mistborn, I know slightly more about than I did about Elantris going in. So here's a full comprehensive list of all the things I know about Mistborn. I know the basics of the magic system, so I know people eat metal to gain powers, and only certain people can eat certain metals, and there's special people called Mistborn who can eat all metals and therefore use all powers. I know that the main characters are named Vin and Kelsier, and they dress like morons in incredibly impractical cloaks. And there's some kind of thieves, criminals, something. I know that the setting is kind of a dystopia, where, like, the Dark Lord, essentially the sort of stereotypical Dark Lord of a fantasy novel, won already in the past, and now he rules the world. So I know that. I know that the third book has a controversial ending that some people love and some people hate. I don't know what it is. I just know it's very polarizing. I know there's people with nails where their eyes should be, or something. I've seen art of that. And I think that's it. I think that's... Oh, and I know that the first book, at least, is, according to Sanderson himself, very much a heist novel, which I'm excited for. I like heist stories. So I'm looking forward to that. And also I know that basically there's not a single person on Earth who's read Mistborn and didn't like it. Like, if Elantris is sort of the black sheep of the Cosmere, then the first Mistborn book and the first Stormlight Archive book, Way of Kings, those two books are the ones that literally no one has anything bad to say about. So I'm very excited for that. Although it does also mean that my expectations are quite high, which will make it easier for me to be disappointed. It's a double-edged sword. Anyway, I'm gonna get onto that. I'm gonna go start reading the first Mistborn book without further ado. Bye!